All right, so we're going to continue on with our reactions lab here. This will be station 3 and station 4. For this reaction here, we're going to be using a test tube. Now, test tubes are notorious for rolling off lab benches here. If I'm not using it, I definitely want to place it inside this test tube rack here. Also, because I'm going to be holding this test tube over a Bunsen burner, I don't want to be grabbing it with my fingers here. What I have here is a test tube clamp. You'll notice that the test tube clamp here is engineered in the closed position. As I apply a little pressure here, I actually have opened the clamp here. The thought here is once I've opened it here, I can actually, as I let go, get the test tube clamp here to close around the test tube here. You'll notice I'm not actually squeezing the test tube clamp here. It's a little counterintuitive here, but there we go. We are holding onto this test tube here. For station number 3 here, we're going to take this chemical here, cupric sulfate, or for us, we're going to call it copper-2 sulfate here. We're going to scoop a little bit of this powder here into the test tube here. As I hold it over the Bunsen burner, I want to make sure that the open end is not facing towards myself. Hold it just slightly ajar here, also not facing other people here in case something spews out. So, for a better look at this reaction here, it's actually best if I don't use too much powder. So I'm just going to grab a little bit of this copper-2 sulfate here. I usually say just a pea-sized amount here. So there we go with our copper sulfate. If I'm not using my copper sulfate here, I'm going to close the lid and just put it aside here. Again, I'm going to hold the test tube here from the test tube clamp here. When I strike it over top of Bunsen burner here, I'm going to gradually wave it over the Bunsen burner so that the heat evenly distributes here. If I hold it too long over a Bunsen burner, sometimes it develops a little bit of soot, and that's not what we want. So for station number 3 here, we're looking specifically at the blue powder itself and seeing what happens to it. So I'm going to strike the Bunsen burner here. I'm going to leave that on my test tube rack there. So let's just strike this here. For this one here, an orange flame here will be decent. So I'm going to grab my test tube here as I just steadily heat it over this flame here. And see if we can compare the before and after. You notice that I'm holding the open end here, pointed away from myself here. I'm hearing a little bit of the sizzle. There's a little bit of that soot forming that I mentioned here. Again, we're going to ignore the soot, but I want to focus mainly on what's happening to the blue powder itself. So just keep waving it around a little bit here. Turn off the Bunsen burner. Might be a little bit hard to see amidst all that soot there. Let's see if I can wipe down a little bit of the soot for you here. If you want to be careful that this test tube here is still going to be hot as you wipe it down a little bit here. So hopefully you can see that a little bit here. So we still have a little bit of blue powder still unchanged there, but you're seeing traces of what's happening when you're heating it up here. What's happening to that blue powder? Okay. You can make some qualitative observations here. Okay. As I mentioned here, this test tube here will still be very hot, so you do want to be careful with it. If you do need to put this down here, you can leave it inside this test tube rack. As I just let it cool for about a minute or so here, we're going to add a little bit of water for reaction number 4. And then again, we're just making some observations. What's going to happen to that slightly whitish, light bluish looking powder here as we end up adding water to it. Now, for a lot of ionic compounds here, when you add water, because it's soluble, it's going to dissolve. So we're expecting to get a sort of blue solution out of it. Again, I want you to focus mainly on what's happening to the powder. So I'm going to add a little bit of water. Still might be a little bit of sizzle because the test tube here is still slightly warm. I just want you to just make some observations. What's happening to that whitish powder that was forming around the initial blue? Okay. This eventually is going to dissolve, okay, but again, the reaction is specifically looking at the solid itself. Okay. I don't know if that's easy to see here. Let's see if I can dump out a little bit of the water here so you can see it better. You can see that a little bit better. So what's happened in reactions 3 and 4? Like this.